Okay. Good afternoon from Rio de Janeiro. Good evening in Europe. We're here gathered for the next section of making sense of the post-COVID world, continuities and changes. This is a lecture series that takes place between the Rio de Janeiro Institute for Social and Political Studies, Freie University Berlin, and the Hamburg Institute for Social Research. This afternoon, well, this evening in Europe, we're very happy to have Yasmeen Arif to join us. And she is an anthropologist working out of the sociology department at Shiv Nadar University, but Professor Sasha Costa is here to make a better introduction of her. Welcome, Yasmeen. It's truly a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Welcome, everyone, and especially welcome, Yasmeen. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. Today, Yasmeen Arif, as mentioned before, is a professor of sociology at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University in the National Capital Region in India. Her current writing is about the biopolitical critique of identity in politics, which follows from her very interesting book, Life, Emergence, the Social in the Afterlives of Violence, published 2016. This research line explores a politics of life across multiple global conditions of mass violence. So her new book project has the preliminary title, Life, Perusing, the Government of Identity. I'm looking very much for reading the book, Yasmeen, and the book explores the new identities in contemporary democracies, labor work, and race, caste, faith orientations. Yasmeen Arif has also conducted field research in Beirut, in Lebanon, and also in Delhi, in India. She also co-edited the volume Critical Themes in Indian Sociology, published by Sage 2018. And I guess this is still a forthcoming book, also edited by Yasmeen Arif, with the title Event and Everyday Empiricisms and Epistemologies. Professor Yasmeen Arif has held positions, among others, at the Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi, University of Minnesota, the Graduate Institute Geneva, the American University of Beirut, Lebanon, among others. And her work has been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Fulbright Narrow Fellowship, among others. So thank you very much again, Yasmeen Arif, for joining us today. We're looking very much forward to listen to your talk and also to discuss with you afterwards. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sergio, and of course Valentina for all the help, and Mariana, who I've just met. It's really a pleasure to be able to engage in a forum like this. What I'm going to talk about today is possibly very new work, but I would really appreciate the engagement. I am going to read a bit because I've been in too many places in the last few weeks, so I need to keep my thoughts together. So just to start off, my talk is really going to be about a political protest in Delhi, which went on during the COVID months. And I'm going to read that event here to understand how crowds, particularly during the time of a highly contagious pandemic, impacts our notions of the pandemic, of the political, I must also mention that as Sergio was saying, that this is part of a larger book called, which tentatively I'm trying to think of it as a Government of Identity. The intent of what I'm talking about today is really to talk with a few or converse with a few biophilosophical ideas from some of the leading thinkers in the area and see how I can extract the meaning of the or the relationship, if you like, between the social and the political. And of course, my empirical context for that is this crowd protest that I'm trying to talk about. My overall understanding is this, which is that the biopolitical paradigm is something that I'll just mention in a few words a little later. While it's become very central in understanding the politics of the pandemic, I do not feel that it conceptualizes the idea of the social enough. And that's precisely what I'm trying to do with this essay. So let me go directly into the event first. Some of you might be aware, but let me just give you a small brief summary of it. So the Indian government passed 3 farm bills in Parliament, what is called the Farm Bills, in Parliament during September 2020. These bills were to have a profound impact on Indian farming practices, ushering in big agribusiness into an unregulated market. Starting from around November 2020, a protest movement grew from the agriculture-intensive states of Punjab and Haryana, which are states, these are agriculture-intensive states in North India, and they rapidly escalated into a nationwide movement that seems to have surpassed public protests even since independence, and by some considerations, even other protest movements around the globe in current times, in recent times. A very striking optic of this protest was the tens of thousands of protesters marching towards the capital city of Delhi in the last weeks of 2020, where they were met with strong police presence who used the predictable repertoire of tear gas shelling, water cannons, etc. Important entry points into Delhi from that moment on was also barricaded with concrete blocks. Nails were cemented onto. So you could see a lot of pictures. And if some of you were aware of this, there were a lot of this was all over social media. So vehicles were not allowed in. There were, wires, trenches, etc., to keep even protesters on foot from entering the city of and the capital city of Delhi. A critical situation unfolded on 26 January 2021, India's Republic Day, when the protesters led a tractor rally into the central part of the city, deviating from their designated routes and moved on towards the main grounds of the occasion, which is the Red Fort, which, as some of you might know, is in the old city of Delhi and the usual place for when where the Republic Day celebrations are usually held. The Prime Minister comes in and so on. A law order situation ensued when a Sikh man, now Sikhs are the religious community associated with Punjab, one of the states that I mentioned. He is alleged to have climbed the ramparts of the Red Fort and to have hoisted a Sikh flag, usually found at their community place of worship, the Gurudwaras, leading to various speculations about the connection of the farmers' movement to a past Sikh militant phase. Most of you might not know about this, but during the 80s, you had a kind of a successionist movement, something that was understood to be a move towards establishing a state called Khalistan by Sikh militancy, which I'm going to come back into a little later. But of course, the dramatic outcome was that the then Prime Minister was Indira Gandhi was assassinated in connection to this particular phase of Punjab history. So what was happening at the time, that notwithstanding the increasing policing, often violent, and all the lives lost, crowds ranging above 500,000 at times to a constant presence of thousands, the protest movement found media coverage and support from groups not just within the country, but across the world. And it lasted until these laws were repealed, which effectively means taken back, on the 29th of November, 2021. All through the year, the year and actually more than a year-long protest, social media and news reports were saturated by images of the crowds of protesting farmers at the Delhi borders. They were settled in tents through the bitter cold of Delhi winters, with makeshift schools, small libraries, temporary hospital arrangements, and massive kitchens delivering food to the inside protesters. These visuals also displayed the immense presence of the police, the concrete barricades, the concertina wires, the nails hammered onto the roads, etc. As mentioned, many incidents of violence erupted during this period, with up to 700 lives lost. Now, during the entire time of the protest, the COVID management measures of social distancing and other directives for COVID-appropriate behavior were in place, with several phases of lockdown as well, as you might also be aware of. The second wave of the pandemic in India, which was in the months of April, May 2021, considered the most lethal so far, took place within the same time span. The government leaders at the time appealed to the farmers to call off the protest, especially in the April-May phase, indicating that the protest could first turn into what in those days was called a super spreader event, when the country's death from COVID had already surpassed 300,000. The Joint Committee of the Farmers had also appealed to the government, saying, please repeal these laws so that the protests can stop, and that the farmers, and in fact, even the policemen, were not exposed to the hazards of the virus. However, when the farm laws actually were repealed, it is obvious that many considered this as a success of a protest movement, in effect, actually success of a democratic movement sustained by action on the streets, and a movement that saw physical participation and solidarity of a variety of groups across the spectrum of gender, political, or regional affiliation. Now, my brief argument that I'm going to share with you today is really not about the protest per se in terms of its own internal political parameters, but more the corporeal, the question, the political question, if you like, of the corporeal physical crowd in the face of governmental techniques of pandemic appropriate behavior, mostly encapsulated in the unlikely phrasing social distancing. So I'm going to go straight into, let's see if I can get to the, can you see the slide, I hope, as I see it?
Yes, we see.
Okay, good. So this is really a quote from Agamben, who as we all probably know, is widely followed in biopolitical concerns, particularly in governmental technique, biopower, and of course, his idea of the political. So this is one of my starting points. So this is something that he writes in April 2020, and he says that although there are, as always, fools who suggest that such a situation can certainly be considered positive, and that the new digital technologies have long allowed people to happily communicate from a distance, I do not believe that a community founded on social distancing is humanly and politically viable. So social distancing, as we know, the world over, has channeled attention towards this combination or conjunction, if you like, of body, space, and the political in unprecedented ways. And this is where I begin my discussion towards how the social as such becomes somewhat invisible or folded in too quickly into the biopolitical paradigm. So given the nature of the pandemic, it's quite obvious that the biopolitical paradigm, which is largely following Foucault, has been at the forefront of theories that seek to make sense of that moment. Now, all of us don't have to be invested in the biopolitical paradigm, so just a couple of lines on what, just a summary of it, that this is a kind of a paradigm where knowledge of the human species meets governance structures, and where the biologically identified body becomes the site for the deployment of governmental power, where governable populations are produced by this kind of biopower. Within the pandemic's conditions, this kind of biopower is formulated as social distancing, inserting, as it were, the innocuous use of the word social in a biopolitical what I'm trying to suggest is that the word social is being introduced into this biopolitical technique that is not really paying attention to what this social could mean as a concept here. So the concerns that really emerge for me are the triangulation between not just the political and the biological, but political, biological, and social. So to get into the argument, barring some few outliers, the biomedical preventive response to the pandemic has followed a singular globally converging governmentality, which is social distancing, as I've said. Succinctly put, the assumption is about a singular virus creating a homogeneous population of human bodies that are globally equal in biomedical terms. Of course, there have been discoveries and investigations about how the virus might not affect all DNA strains equally, and we already know that it has different pathological effects on different biological profiles like age, gender, comorbidities, and so on. Notwithstanding, all these categories adhere to the universal biomedical sense of human species life, and consequently, a wall is devised between humans and the virus. It is likely that for the first time in human history, because of the conditions of mobility and density that the contemporary allows, a biomedical humanity unified under the threat of a single virus can be imagined. At this current time, different vaccines, as we all know, following different sorts of medical technologies, have also been widely disseminated. And the general assumption is that while the virus mutates, it's likely that vaccination and community level immunities will lessen the virulence of the disease. So therefore, to just recap, my first observation then, and that this is an unprecedented recognition, especially in biopolitical terms, of a universal global medical condition and a universal governmental strategy. So because what you usually have in biopolitical concerns is that different anatomical or biomedical or biosocial profiling will construct multiple populations, which will be accompanied by differing strategically targeted biopower and governmental action. So this has typically been used, for example, in the way in which governmental technique produce racialized populations, and particular techniques of governing those populations are invented. Now, the second observation, and this is something that I really focus on, is that there is a profound displacement of meaning in the phrase social distancing. This universal governmental strategy addressing human species life as such is in effect a technique of physical distancing and not social distancing at all. This little slippage of terminology, which might appear almost silly and banal, leads to the larger questions of the social body and the political body and their geometrics and geopolitics of space. For all practical purposes, the jurisdiction that this terminology obscures is that, in effect, it is meant entirely to regulate and monitor spaces between physical individual bodies. This important displacement needs to be underlined at this point. So let me just recap yet again, just to get the point across and set the pace for the next idea that I want to think through, is that first, of course, the slippage between physical distancing and social distancing, as I mentioned, and that second, the universal biological human and diverse social communities. This is where I'm trying to bring in the idea of social communities. Now, let us go back to what Agamben has been preoccupied. That is the question he has been talking about, the idea of the question of how physical distancing does not allow the formation of the crowd, and that if there is no crowd, then there is no political potency. And this kind of passive paralysis that social distancing brings along is actually also the death of political potential. So let us take a look at the words that follow from the last few words that we said. And he says this: a first consideration concerns the truly singular nature of the phenomena that the measures of social distancing have produced. In Elias Canetti's masterpiece, Crowds and Power, he defines the crowd or the mass on which power is based as the inversion of the power of being touched. While men usually fear being touched by the stranger and all the distances that men establish around themselves arise from this fear, the mass is the only situation in which this fear is overturned to become its opposite. It is only in a crowd that man can become free of this fear of being touched. That is the only situation in which the fear changes into its opposite. As soon as a man has surrendered himself to the crowd, he ceases to fear its touch. This reversal of the fear of being touched belongs to the nature of crowds. So obviously, Agamben rightly summons Canetti's masterpiece, and many have done in the reading of crowds, and the political charge that emerges in that visceral proximity. He is particularly focused on Canetti's idea that fear rules that inability to touch, to be skin to skin, body to body among strangers. And it is the power in the kinesthetics of the crowd that dispels that fear and sustains the political moment of the collective, of solidarity. And in the realm of public protest, it is obvious that this is a powerful, transformative haptic and optic energy. So what Agamben is worrying about is that social distancing threatens that crowd to obliteration. No proximity, no assembly, and thus no political life. So now, in his opinion, of course, social media or virtual communities are not a substitute. So even outside of Agamben, many have commented on how the lockdown measures, and not just in India, anywhere in the world, have implied severe curtailment of civil liberties. They mention these sorts of curtailments as the ways and routes through which state structures gain more and more control over bodies made docile. And however, and this is where I move away from the idea of this universal idea of the crowd form of the universal crowd, and get into the form of protest crowd, which is something which is peculiar to distinct communities, to the located histories and the emplaced times, and I index these as the social. Then it becomes quite evident that despite the pandemic all across the globe, crowds did materialize as protest or as political gatherings. The technique of physical distancing clearly did not diminish the surge of crowds or their political potential, as Agamben lamented. The question then remains, if in the pandemic conditions that we have known and we might know in the future, if crowds are the location of political potential, what happens when a life-threatening, fear-inducing virus is thrown into the mix? What implications do they have in biopower and governmentality? Now, this takes us back to the difference between social and physical distancing that I've been going on about, and how that difference is leading to a misunderstanding of power and to a confusion in political potential. The governmental strategy of physical distancing works exactly with Canetti's idea of fear of touching. Governmental power seeks to regulate and monitor that physical space between bodies in a pandemic, in fact, creating a sense of that fear. By invoking a unified population produced by the COVID-19 virus, where everybody is equally at risk, this technique endorses the notion that the risk is individual and immunity is possible only when physical bodies stay apart from another. This is, of course, as we also know, a required biomedical necessity, even if it is just in theory. Governmental strategy also translates this to the only technique it knows, that of law and order regulations with which to monitor that space between individuals. However, the worldwide proliferation of political crowds in the time of the pandemic, I am persuaded, is indeed about displaying acutely, first, the power of the social over the biological. The formation of crowds in political protests where biological fear should have kept people apart was, in fact, an expression of the priority of the social in both its historical and geographical specificities, which made that protest possible in the first place. I emphasize again that these crowds and their assemblies are an articulation of, as I said, the social, which is embedded in geographical and historical particulars. In other words, they are specifics, they are social specifics that come alive in the face of a homogenizing virus. Biomedical considerations that are central in the management of a pandemic attend to the universal human as a species, and those considerations tend to homogenize, as has commonly been debated. This is a common part of the debate, right? And in that homogenization, the typical social structural classifications of class, gender, race, as we have seen over and over again in many discussions, they come out into critical relief. Those critical dividing classifications are very much a part of all the debates, as I said, that we have been hearing over time. But the question that seems important now is, despite those dividing parameters, how does the social render as collective or community as against a universal human species that needs to protect itself at the time of a pandemic? How does that social behave and impact, especially when biological fear is expected to prevail? So let me sort of try and answer and respond to my own question as a proposition, which is that the social, in fact, is the final intent of biopolitical governmentality, not so much human species bodies as the typical biopolitical paradigm tries to tell us. Let me explain this, and I'll suggest a one step back to outline some contours of the social as I offer as an idea that the social is an a priori. I offer these contours, of course, this is not a resolve analytic, this is work in progress, but I do intend to follow this proposition through. So my first point in this argument is, again, the reiteration of the slippage between the naming, the social versus physical distancing. I suggest that physical distancing is a biomedical possibility and potential, but that social distancing is not. Simply because, and without intending undue provocation, there is no such thing as the human without the social. It is only because there is no possibility of fragmenting the social that separation is imagined in the realm of physical bodies and that physical distancing is initiated. Bodies can be separated, but the social cannot. A remarkable endorsement comes from Foucault in his Birth of Biopolitics when he suggests, and this is something I'm just keeping out there as a sort of a support for my argument, when he's trying to say that when there is no such thing, that we keep imagining that there is a movement of either nature to history or from society to non-society, but that there is no human nature which is separate from the very fact of society. Now, let me try and explain this a little further. What I'm trying to suggest is that the social is indeed distinct and perhaps a priori to the rest of what we call political, juridical, and economic. It is a distinct a priori condition of the human, and by some current empirical work, especially in non-human life, even in trees, we are beginning to see a place of what we are trying to think about as social here. So let me now move to as I was saying, that I'm trying to have a sort of a conversation with some of the main biopolitical thinkers at this time. So in response to an interview query on his recent book on institutions and the political, Roberto Esposito, whose work I follow quite closely, implies a similar priority of the social with reference to Claude Lefort's notion of political conflict. Let me just give you his words again. This Lefortian approach sees in conflict the very form of the social, that is, the social is conflictual. If there were no political conflicts, the social would be undifferentiated. It would be a mass made up of many disconnected individuals lacking a political form. The political form institutes an arena that grants space to opposition and struggle at the heart of the social field. Carl Schmitt, who's certainly not a leftist theorist and much vilified in my opinion, made a similar argument. According to him, if there are no conflicts, there are no communities, and if there is no adversary, people do not even identify each other as friends. So let me try and see what is it that Esposito seems to suggest for my argument. He's saying that the social is indeed, of course, with Lefort and Schmitt, that the social is indeed the conglomeration of contesting collectivities. The social is that which comes into being on account of that conglomeration of contestation over over varying interests. That is, in effect, the assembly of the social. In short, the social, first and foremost, is an agglomeration of contestation, the historical and geographical particulars of time and space that I mentioned earlier. And the political is that which represents that contestation and thus is an innate given as soon as the social is already there, so to speak. So where am I going with all of this? In the range of discussion on the political that has grabbed attention during this pandemic, it is not difficult to see that while everyone is overwhelmed by the notion of social distancing, the understanding of the social is below the sign of the political. It is understood in relation to a notion like that of the social contract and, of course, its violations in the pandemic, which in a sense is a political, economic, and juridical relationship labeled as social. The idea of the social in my proposal is not exhausted by the kind of social in the social contract, which in fact is one of constructed, intentional, rational, and purposeful cooperation. And the social contract, as Foucault perhaps is trying to suggest in the short quotation above, is something that is not something that needs to come after the already existing human, the already social. To be human is to be social, and to be social is to politically exist in contestation. However, it is the presence of the physical body as contagious and proximity as lethal in this pandemic that complicates the political space into a biopolitical space. And this is where the question of the crowd as a political and corporeal mass, as it unfolded in the pandemic, becomes important. So to pursue this, I'm trying to again build up this argument that to pursue this as a segue to what I'm trying to slowly try and argue here, the obvious implication is that the immunization of the physical body is not the same as the immunization of the social collective. The physiology of the first, that is the body, is not the same as the sociology of the second, that is the social collective. Biology perhaps embodies and individuates, but the social produces groupings and collectivizes. While the biological body can try to immunize against another biological body, the collective body immunizes against other social collective bodies. And it is that political antagonism that governmentality aims at capturing, not the space between proximal individual bodies. Now, let me try and explain this better with examples from some of the protesting crowds that we know of during the pandemic. We're aware, for example, of the Black Lives Matter protest over the 2020 summer in the United States, the Belarusian protest, the Capitol incident, and also, of course, the fairly well represented citizenship amendment protest in Delhi as well. I'm not going to go into the citizenship protests because it is complicated. It is, of course, the second part of this chapter, but I'm going to keep that away for now. But all those instances occurred in severe pandemic conditions, as were many other political mass movements lasting several days, if not longer, in various parts of the world. I've also briefly given you a sense of the farmers' protests. In all of these events, the following seems to be clear. The immunizing instinct of the individual body should have had an impact on how individuals conduct themselves in physical space. However, when the social is an a priori, the immunizing instinct of the individual body is willing and persuaded or obliged and coerced to be subservient to the social collective, the social common that they think they are part of. In the social, the body does not recognize the need or feel the fear to immunize from another threatening biological In the United States, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests are about racialized social collectives attempting to immunize themselves against brutal prejudices of other collectives. Eventually, this is a protest against a nation colored by white ideology collectives, which is defined, and these are collectives which are defined by that ideology, In India, the farmers are allegedly poised against the ideologies of a market-driven developing nation. But here, there is a very fine-tuned difference, and this is also another part of my argument here, is that there is a difference between something like the Black Lives Matter protest and those of the farmers. The former, that is the Black Lives Matter, is based on a socially ascribed identity, whereas the latter, that is the farmers' protest, is an occupational collective. It's interesting to note that perhaps, and I'm not very sure when I make this statement, that in independent India, this is perhaps the first protest based on an occupation. So I will emphasize that it is significant to see how the protest, in fact, throughout the farmers' protest, there is a sliding in and out of identity significations. So where these farmers, for example, are sliding between their role as a collective, which, as I said, is congealing around an occupational identity, that is of farmers, or sociocultural and religious regional identities. Either they are Sikh or they are farmers. Right? Either they are from Punjab or they are farmers. Now, I'll return to this point a little later. These constructions dictate what kind of immunizing practices will be deployed, who will immunize, and who will be immunized against. The universal biological threat or the individual contagious biological body seems to disappear from public space. When these social identities, like in these protests, collectivize and immunize against other such identity collectives, they bring in the force of a crowd and dispel the fear of the body, the fear of the physical haptic. Even when the farmers collectivize and their individual biological bodies are suspended in the need to immunize against the collective state apparatus and those other agglomerations which support the state perspective, there is a particular a way in which the question of the individual biomedical body seems to be suspended. In both reality and in abstraction, through crowds or through virtual media, the social assembly of contestation materializes. The governmental technique to build physical distance between bodies remains important, and in practice, there is nothing with which to discipline the individual body against other individual biomedical bodies. So to return to Agamben's use of connectees touching crowds, the contagion, if I may call it that, is a social contagion, not a physical one. The power of the political or the potential of political collective emerges from that of a social haptic or a social touch, not a physical touch. I would like to propose two further important nuances here. As I said in the beginning, my proposal is that at the heart of governmentality, going against a typical biopolitical approach, the desire lies to govern the social, the community, the collective, not the nation constituted by individual citizens. In my small example of crowds and political protest here, I gesture towards the conduct of socially inscribed beings, those with ascriptive identities who are then classified into political, juridical, economic, and perhaps biological beings. So what I'm suggesting is the socially ascripted populations are first things that are produced, and that is what governmentality tries to control, not so much individual biological bodies. Second, this is why governmentality or anyone speaking for the state apparatus is at pains to identify populations socially and not physically. Socially ascribed populations attempt to immunize against other populations or collectivize in the first place to protect themselves against other collectives. Governmentality or statecraft can co-opt that collectivizing social intent into political strategy, as the power to immunize is in fact the power to declare the borders and boundaries between collectives and communities. If the farmers are from a social community, then they can and must be immunized against. However, if they are not from a socially ascribed identity, then immunizing against an occupation, especially one that provides food, farming, the very lifeline of biological existence, becomes a difficult strategy. So returning to my earlier point then the power that is emanating from the social in producing these collectives and populations, this is the power that governmentality and statecraft tries to co-opt. As the farmers' protest surged on in India for all those months, there have been many analyses about various kinds of caste-class alliances and the electoral politics that were involved in all these various alliances. They're all, in fact, in a certain sense, I feel they are supportive of my notion that the idea is that let us not think about these farmers as an occupational collective, but rather that as social communities occupying a zone of conflict. Eventually, when the resolution to repeal the laws, the farm laws, came along, it was apparently passed in Parliament without discussion, despite the long period of extremely visible and volatile protest. A very significant symbolic signature of the government was to announce the repeal, this recall of these laws, on Guru Purab, the birth anniversary of Guru Nanak, the spiritual founder of Sikhism, and one of the most important days of the Sikh calendar. This reinforced the dominating perception of the protest that the face of the protest was the Sikh community of the North Indian state of Punjab. Now, at the same time, the other side of the coin was that when it came to vilifying the protest at various junctures, Sikhs as an anti-national force were also widely discussed in government as well as social media platforms. As I'd mentioned, the Sikh community of Punjab, in a certain sense, was something in the 1980s, which Punjab went through a militant phase, as I said, which was about the making of Khalistan, obviously considered a secessionist move, effectively a certain sense that the Sikh community, especially with the incredible worldwide diasporic support from the same community, sort of made this a part of very noisy debates around that time, mentioning this aspect of the farmers' protests. So, as I said, even the 26th January event was also understood along these sorts of interpretive lines. But as I'm trying to suggest, that this is what was going on both sides, as I read it. On one side, an occupational collective, and the other side, a social collective. And it was in the intention of the state, in fact, to understand and govern this population through that socially ascribed identity. So this is where I'm going to try and bring my threads of this argument to a sort of a speculative closure, where I want to examine what I'm trying to call both the assertive and the vulnerable face of the social, the way in which I've tried to think of the social, and the way it lends itself to governmental control. And it is really in the presence of extreme biological vulnerability, like in this and perhaps possible, hopefully not, future pandemic times, that the social presents itself more acutely, either as a lack or as an excess. The lack in the social, in my proposition, is that of the common individual, often called humanity, however rhetorical. And the excess is the ability of the social to be divisive. Now, Agamben, ironically enough, makes a remarkable statement in a set of essays that he had written after the Tiananmen Square incident, which I'm sure all of you would have heard of. At the time, in a book which is now fairly old, it was written in 2007, in a book called The Coming Community, he reads the incident at Tiananmen Square, that famous optic of the student in front of the tank. He reads the incident as an event where democracy and freedom, as the stated objectives, are much too generic and broadly defined to get at the heart of what that event was actually about. Rather, for him, the event meant the potential of coming politics. So let me share his words, which I feel are very important. He says, the novelty of the coming politics is that it will no longer be a struggle for the conquest or control of the state, but a struggle between the state and the non-state. Humanity. This has nothing to do with the simple affirmation of the social in opposition to the state that has often found expression in the protest movements of recent years. In the final instance, the state can recognize any claim for identity, even that of a state identity within the state. What the state cannot tolerate in any way, however, is that the singularities form a community without affirming an identity, that humans co-belong without any representable condition of belonging. A being radically devoid of any representable identity would be absolutely irrelevant to the state. So for me, the startling meaning that pushes through is this. This is the idea that bears allegiance to the possibility of a non-identity, where singularity matters more than collectives of socially ascribed essence in society. The last statement here, of being radically devoid of any representable identity, would be absolutely irrelevant to the state, is especially pertinent. It seems to me that the irrelevance of those who do not have any socially immune identity to offer has been particularly stark in the pandemic. By this, I mean the purely physical body masked into purely corporeal collective, like that of the hordes of migrant workers that all of us, I'm sure, have seen, the exodus of these thousands and thousands of migrant workers who were leaving the city, and also, of course, the already assembled crowds in the dense slums of India. In many ways, this is the vulnerability of any, each, and all bodies that cannot command choice in social space, whether in the global north or in the global south. Their vulnerability is also their inability to claim any individual social space that can make claims for political space. For example, the claim over a laboring body and a home for that body is a claim for social space, and that inability to command that space is also an inability to command immunity from other contagious bodies. I would think that their vulnerability is their inability to immunize themselves as purely biomedical physical entities. And this is where governmentality fails to provide that space of physical immunity. Rather, they are found irrelevant, and they may have even been found relevant to state power if they had summoned a social identity rather than being just a pure biological body. In order to be politically potent, they needed to have a social identity, which I'm suggesting is that pure physical body does not make any relevance to the state. This is the social excess that the state co-opts to summon immunizing mechanisms of social boundary-making power. So what I'm trying to say is that the state makes use of those sorts of collectives that literally offer themselves to the state in order to enable further governmental practices of boundary making. The biological bodies, on the other hand, do not have such an option. The problem that remains then is this: what kind of social collective is on the ascendance in our contemporary? What are those identities that break the flesh and blood common and build immunizing boundaries around them? How do these boundaries in effect weaken the political and strengthen politics? With Agamben's earlier writings then, I would like to consider the coming politics of pure bodies in public political sphere. And I would like to think that it is quite possible to read the spectacular protest crowds during the pandemic as that kind of future politics. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Okay. Thank you so much.
I came late. I'm Mauricio Dominguez. Hi, Yasmeen.
Hi. Nice to see you. I think I have stopped the share, right? It's worked successfully? Yes.
Yes, you did. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Thank
good.
you.
Okay.
Okay, would any of you like to begin as I find our students' questions here? Thank you so much for this, Yasmeen. Very inspiring.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
If I really understood the gist of your argument, what are you trying to say that there is beyond this more, well, certainly beyond necropolitics, which I've seen you work with that, and I agree with you. People have overemphasized this sort of topic, but also in relation to governmentality, which would be a positive sort of biopolitics. What are you saying is, in fact, that this is not exclusively exercised from the top down, but it's actually an interactive relationship between state and society, which would mean really a strong shift in relation to Foucault's original formulation. Just to make sure that I understood what you're saying on a more general plan.
Yes, I think you've got the, shall I say, the argument at the heart of it, which is to say that I'm not suggesting that Foucault does not have a sense of the social in his biopolitical argument. Of course he does. But I think the way in which the notion of the social has largely been thought of in biopolitics does not allow for this fact, which I was doing in my earlier work as well, that it is not just knowledge that we have understood to be the human species knowledge that Foucault's talk about. I'm suggesting the social already in its capacity of producing collectivities is able to produce populations, which will now be is able to then give themselves, if you like, I don't know if that's the right choice of words, but it literally seems like the social production of populations is taken over by governmental power. And this is ultimately the shift, as you're saying, from the Foucauldian idea, is to suggest that at the heart of biopolitics, it's not individual bodies, but it is the social that is being aimed at. That is what is going to, the control of the social is what I think I'm trying to push forward, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps I can continue on this, because I think this would be sort of follow-up Mauricio's question, because and the consequence you extract, if I understood the argument correctly, is that during the pandemic, this sort of possibility of social identities became reduced or even disappeared. And what I'd like to understand better this argument, because actually you still had also social identities in terms of controlling which group gets vaccinated first, or also defining what are essential workers, who are not essential workers. So this whole instruments of classifying, governing the population, they were to a certain extent even more emphasized than in times outside the pandemic. So therefore, just for me to understand better this part of the argument, what is this absence of social identities you mentioned at the end of your talk?
The end, I mean, if I can respond to your question from the end, from what I said, what I've said is this, that is it possible, and this is literally in the realm of philosophical speculation, that how do we think about governmentality, which has less control over the social, is to offer the idea of non-identity, right? And by non-identity, I don't mean the disappearance of social. I'm asking to think about what is it that the social can produce, which is either divisive, groups, which are then taken, co-opted by the government, or social identities which are already there, the kind that you're talking about, right? The way in which you had these divisions right from day one, who will be protected, who will be vaccinated, across the world in different ways, the social structural kinds of categories were already part of this. And as we also know, those categories very much are located in the social. What I'm suggesting is that when it came to crowd protest politics, right, another kind of social classification came into place, right, which is that those, and this is where I am trying to think through, I don't have an argument, I feel that the farmers' protest, in a certain sense, was a success because the divisive power of a particular kind of social identity actually went into a certain kind of denial. It was the occupational, the idea that these are farmers, that these are people who produce food. This is what is something that was on the ascendance. Whereas the government tried over and over again to call them Sikhs, or call them people who are regionally affiliated to this category, to that category. So what you're seeing is a variety of ways in which the social produces different collectives. The point is, what is it that the government can take on and control as biopolitical control? That's the point. And I'm saying that, in fact, if you could get the government to control individual bodies, it would mean that the government would need to give them space, protected space, secure space, like a home. That's what the government completely denies, right? What they're more interested in is actually these collectives. So what I'm suggesting is that it is the inability, in fact, for a particular kind of pure biopolitics, which is the positive, affirmative way in which the government can take care of individual bodies. That is not what government does. It, in fact, tries to identify these individuals as parts of collectives, which actually should be divided up into different groups. So your gender, your race, your etc., all fall into these sorts of categories. That's the kind of overall point. I hope I've been able to clarify that. Yeah.
Can I build up on that very quickly before we open up to the general public? So it has to do exactly with what you were just saying, right? When the whole thing is your argument perhaps more discernible in the South? Because like when you're talking about social distancing, right? The idea of social distancing as it was promoted, it involved certain, households, a certain idea of a household, a certain idea of a neighborhood, a certain idea of social life, and a certain idea of the everyday, right? Yeah. And I really think that, I'm thinking about that, right? When you're talking about social distancing, when you're talking about a slum in India or a slum here in Brazil, what you see is something that's very different from the idea of social distancing that began in Europe, for instance. So here in Brazil, there was something that was really interesting going on, is that the government did absolutely nothing. But the state has very capillary powers, especially in terms of public health system, right? So what you had was a response from former government workers, former people that worked as community agents for the states, and they were acting like the state would act with the state techniques, but without the state. And so I think that's a very interesting way that you've showed us to look at this, because once you go in, you see these other sorts of social identities that were operating and that were really useful in handling the pandemic, at least from down here, from there. Am I sort of, did I get what you're saying in some way?
Absolutely. You've got the finger exactly on the kind of argument. See, this is, I said, this is part of a larger argument. My point is that the social is not adequately understood in the larger biopolitical paradigm. And precisely because of this, and you're absolutely right, I'm talking at this point of crowd protests or protest crowds, whichever way, in the South, right? And in that particular empirical context, and if I were to go into the citizenship protests as well, which was largely thought of through the Muslim lens, you sort of get this sense of social in a particular way. We know that the religion, the caste, the etc., the region, etc. What you are talking about is another kind of social. Right. And this is why I'm trying to bring in this distinction between the social as an excess and the social as a lack. Now, because I follow Esposito quite a bit, we are somewhere trying to think about biopolitics also as affirmative. Right. So in your kind of social, it is quite possible that you can use a social collective idea, identity idea, in order to bring in resources from the state for good reason. Right? What I'm saying, the excess is when society itself produces divisions, which the state can take and actually try and deny those that potential, right? So it is, in fact, the notion of the social, if you foreground it, you begin to see how it is, there is a possibility of understanding it as a very crucial part of what we understand to be biopolitical governmentality. See, what was happening during in the pandemic is that, you had the biological body, and we knew that every biological body fell into some social structure classification, right? Whether it was age, whether it was race, whether it was gender. I'm saying that those debates are absolutely correct. But let's look at what is the potential of the social here. What is it doing in this sort of politics, right? So that's largely the argument. But thank you. Yeah, that's quite the comparative angle, which is very important for what I'm trying to think through.
Thank you. And I think that, I'm sorry to interrupt and like to make it my turn again, but since I'm talking here, I have the floor. But I was just wondering if you could go back to the question of naming, because that was what sort of the students read. That's where their questions are going to go. And I think that in your reply to me, there's something implicit about the power of naming, or who's naming, who gets to name what, under what conditions.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And that's the kind of, and as I said, I mean, this is a very large kind of an argument that I'm condensing into 40 minutes, but, naming is also a certain part of this. As then it's like suggesting that the government or state takes on the power of naming, which is when the assertion of the self is the ability to name yourself as something that can claim not just a social space, but eventually political and economic space. So that's the kind of argument that I'm moving towards.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Perhaps I can also follow this question, because one of the questions suggested by or made by the students based on the text is connected to the role of the corona deniers, because and the question will be how to frame it into your discussion on crowds, because actually the question asked by the students is more related to your idea of this sort of chains, metonymic chains, and I can read exactly the question, because I think this is quite interesting question. Yeah,
it's a very good question.
Yes, yeah. So how can the principle of this metonymic chains be applied to corona deniers? They also develop their terms such as Bill Gates, Shiv, and take action through demonstrations. Where does their responsibility lie in relation to the attributed metonym, especially as they also create conspiracy theories? Could their emergence be explained by the metonymic gaps? So perhaps if you can go into both. So in this discussion, how to frame the corona deniers into your discussion crowds, and also I think this discussion to metonymic gaps could be also interesting to be addressed if you like. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm just for the others who are listening in and may not be aware of the fact that the students have read another essay of mine, which actually, frankly, I've forgotten what I've written in it very clearly, but little bit I do remember. I mean, I didn't realize, but anyway, never mind. Of course, I do remember what I meant, but this is a very, very interesting question. Again, see, this is the two sides of the same coin that I keep talking about, right? That if I remember correctly, what I was trying to suggest is that what is the meaning of metonymy? It is a kind of associative link, right? That one is following from the other. So the minute you start denying a virus, right, it is almost like, if you remember that there was a Iranian president who was a bit of a clown who wanted to deny the presence of homosexuality. That once you put in a name, like saying that there is no virus or there is no such thing as homosexuality, the metonyms that will follow from there will carry its own conceptual circle. Right. So you can imagine how it will move into, corona deniers were also part of, I'm not sure if the student is gesturing towards that, but let's say your Trump voters. right? I mean, there is a mass of them who believe that there was no corona and this was some sort of a major leftist conspiracy and who knows what, right? So, but what was happening there? If you start thinking about the way they moved forward, they actually, and these are very, I mean, it's very peculiar to call them interesting, but they were interesting, which is that they moved into actual techniques of how they conducted themselves in public space, one of which was not wearing masks. So one of the things, so what happened in the United States, for example, was that you had literally mask wearing. That we are either for or against this kind of theory, right? That these were the corona deniers. The mask is just, and so you heard all these people who were talking in public debates that our right to breathe and our right to air and whatnot else was pulled in, and also. So you see how that metonymy is moving. It's moving from denying a virus. It's moving into saying that the virus is not airborne. Therefore, we don't need to think of protecting ourselves from the air around us. Therefore, we don't need to wear a mask. And therefore, you go on to thinking about right to air, right to breathing, and whatnot else, right? So there is an associative link in both sides. Now, if, like in Brazil, as best as I understand from my friends, there's literally a time when people were, or at least your famous president was trying to say there is no corona, there is no coronavirus. I mean, this is just something that it's like the flu, it will disappear in 5 minutes, right? So all of this did happen. So now if you had, and Trump did have that particular kind of political, governmental political decisions, right? He made those decisions of not for a long time, not allowing a number of things that happened later. So if you think about this in a sense of that theoretical metonymic idea that I'm talking about, it leads in both directions. It's literally what do you associate with what? And governmental technique, in a certain sense, only takes on that precedence. It just builds up that link, and then it becomes something to move on into the next decision. So, so that's how I think I'm hoping I'm addressing that question. There's, I think, a comment in the chat box. I'm trying to pull it up. Can you see it? I'm just trying.
Yeah, I can see it. Can you see it? Do you want me to read it, or can you see it?
Yes, please. Something is happening to my screen. It's not showing up.
No problem. No problem. It appears, this is what they say, okay? It appears that social distancing is a kind of Freudian slip that betrays the fact that the intent of biopolitics is secretly the regulation of social collectives and not individual/biological bodies. Is that the argument that's being advanced?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. That's the whole point, that the Foucauldian biopolitics, and again, I'm not going to say that Foucault is the only biopolitical creator of the biopolitical. There have been others who talked about it many years before that, but of course, the most powerful rendition comes from him. But one of the things that comes out of his paradigm, and others who have taken it on, including Agamben to an extent, is that it is within governmental power, with the knowledge of the human species that has come about, which is literally more physiological, anatomical features, that a particular set of populations, so for example, a population of diabetics can be created such that the pharmaceutical industry and the government in coalition with that can produce a certain kind of medication. I mean, we understand those typical physiological production of populations, or nutrition. So who is below the poverty level, who is above, those sorts of categories. But what I'm suggesting is that it's not a denial of all that, but I'm suggesting that the actual intent, it seems to me, is the final biopolitical frontier is really the social. And that is because the social is, as I said, is a prior to all the others, to the juridical, to the political, to the economic. And therefore, it is possibly important to understand what the social actually implies in the biopolitical paradigm. I hope that makes sense. Do we know who said that comment? And I know maybe if he or she is around.
There is a further question also from the students that I think this could be also interesting to see how this work to the framework we have just showed us, is the connection between the whole telecommunications, internet, and the social. So, and perhaps in order to make the question compatible with the discussion just now, the question would be what kind of consequences the existence of divisions of a sort of social identities constructed at the level of digital communication, of social networks and so on, digital networks. How does this affect your concept of the social and also your concept of the political? Is that something that could be understood among or under corona conditions, a sort of substitution for the articulations of social identities in the public sphere and so on? This is completely a different sphere. How do you see this?
No, not at all. I mean, there is, again, another very interesting question. Thank you. I mean, this is, look, this is where the whole problem started, right? When Agamben makes this, and everybody got terribly upset that someone like Agamben actually said that social media is really meant for fools. Right. And especially it is effectively saying that, you know, unless and if you remember, that was the time when Italy was going through its hardest moment. And, you know, there were all these visuals of these empty streets and everything else. So the idea there was that, you know, he was trying to suggest that, look, with social distancing, people will move into this whole media world. And you think that this media world is capable of political potential. Now, we know very well that the potential of any media platform for any political sort of is beyond belief, right? Now, my point is that it works both ways. And the question that is being asked has a very, very you know, significant answer, which is that just as the social is able to produce both assertive, right, or divisive categories, it is the same social that produces those divisions in social media as well. Right. So if you have, I mean, there is nothing, it's a no-brainer in many ways. The same, you look at the ways in which, I'm not sure what other examples to give, but you just look at, because we are somehow able to talk about America in many ways that I'm not, in a certain sense, have the freedom to talk about India at this current moment, if I plan to return home. So the point is that effectively, what do you see? There are, you know, the simple thing that young people call trolling, etc. But these are all social identities which are asserting themselves in media space, and these are social divisions. Technology has got nothing to do with it. You can use technology to do this or that. But my point is the social ends up becoming even more powerful than the media itself. Right, so it's not like the medium decides or equalizes, which was the earlier idea of communication. It's not that. And this is why that in any which sphere that I'm dealing with, and this is why I'm thinking about this as a philosophy before really coming up with empirical examples. But wherever I do go to understand this idea, I begin to see that there is a way in which the social is not, and I don't yet have a proper answer, what is it that I will define the social to be, but we call it with very vague names, right? Religion and caste and region and kinship and family and neighborhood, and we have all these names in anthropology and sociology, but we don't necessarily have a very clear idea of what is it that this social does. Right. And as something that, as in a question in technology, certainly, we know that this is another place where the medium cannot, which is supposed to be one of the most secular mediums in the world, cannot deny the social. So this is again, as I said, it's a very significant response. And within the COVID situation, it was very interesting how it really, it kept going up and down, right? It created energy where people were feeling distanced, but at the same time created a lot of divisive issues as well. So this is the kind of point that I'm trying to make.
I have another question more connected to the other lectures we had, in which became quite evident the importance of households in terms of sociability during the pandemic. So households is a space in which we have not only families living together, but also workers working together in a certain way, also students having classes together, and so on. So the household became a sort of concentrate space of socialization. And my question to you is if you have any kind of reflection on the role of households during the pandemic in the construction of what you call the social.
Yes, absolutely. The question of household, when you're saying household, I'm going to give it a kind of a spatial space-related reading. When you say household, and I would like to think again, perhaps metonymically, that something in the household is also something similar which connects to the classroom, perhaps connects to a workspace where people expect to relate to each other in secure, safe space. That's the sense, and that's the sense of safety, which also permeates into the idea of the social, that being in your own home, which is the spatial equivalent to the household, right? There is something. Now, my point in this is that if you have a home, that's the first question. Do you have a home? Now, this is the point that I'm trying to make. And this is another point which connects maybe for all of us in the global South, is that, when the West is lamenting the inability to be socialized, etc., I'm suggesting that here there is a situation where people cannot separate from each other. They do not have the privilege of space to separate from each other. Forget about safe space. Right? You're looking at a place when you are by force. And this is what I'm saying, that when people do not even have homes, what kind of safety and security are you talking about? This is the safety and security that individual bodies need, the safe space to be in. Right. So, there were stories which I heard, and there's work now that in Australia, for example, where maybe there are way lesser human beings than the rest of us, you effectively had people, the government actually picked up the homeless and put them in hotel rooms. That's a technique of trying to manufacture safe space for individual bodies. Of course, such a thing cannot be thought of in India, right? It cannot even be. So the lack of space becomes a lack of that social, right? In both ways, that safe space as safe. Space as ability to be secure, at the same time separated biologically, right? So these are the kinds of ways in which this sense of the social then becomes more and more important to think through. I hope somewhere I somewhere saw suddenly some questions popped up on my screen. Is that some Q&A box also you have somewhere? Maybe see my cursor when there seems to be another question. This is where
Maurice is in line, and then I can read you the following question. Okay, go ahead, Maurice. Okay, don't worry, I'll read it for you.
Well, I want to sort of go back to what I had asked, but including something that I find particularly interesting, that's a discussion about the creation of collectivity, right? Let's see, because I have worked a bit on that. They actually published a paper in Thesis 11, which is exactly about this, connecting Latin America and India. Dialoguing a bit with Pata Chatterjee and Benedict Anderson.
Yes.
Serialities, open serialities, closed serialities. but trying to connect this to the idea of biopolitics. And I have the feeling, well, if you take, for instance, all these cash transfer schemes that you have in Brazil, in Latin America, but you find in India as well, Bolsa Familia and other things like that, family grant in Brazil has the codes. You would have exactly this creation of collectivities through the state, right? Through social policy, which is a sort of closed seriality, operated from the top down by the state, which is a sort of very clear state-based biopolitics. But on the other hand, it deals with the demands of society in the sense that combating poverty, extreme poverty, hunger is a demand of society. So you have this sort of dialect between what society demands and what the state furnishes, or the political system, to be a bit sometimes more specific, is providing. And I have the feeling, for instance, in India, that intellectuals have a big problem with dealing the idea that the state has and should have an agenda. If you take Pata Chatterjee, if you take Ashish Nanda and other people who I have read rather extensively, there is a sort of resistance among Indian intellectuals to accept exactly this more complex relationship. Although, of course, there are a lot of variations between authors. But if you could, it's a long question, but if you could comment a bit on that, that'd be good.
Now, I'm going to try and see if I can answer this in any meaningful way. Look, I do understand it coming from, let's say, there are two sides to your question, actually. One is, the one answer is perhaps more or less simple in the sense that it's something that I've already mentioned before. This is the point that there is governmental power. And I don't belong to that world which says that anything that comes out of the state is bad. That's clearly the question of governance and the question of administration. These are two ideas that we need to think very, very importantly. The first idea, which is governance and governmentality, that Foucauldian thing, is something that I'm talking about. Right? Administration is what I feel Foucault is talking about more. So when you're looking at these kinds of poverty categories, for example, right? When you're talking about, let's say, in India, of course, it has mostly been poverty, jobs, subsistence, livelihood, etc., right? All of these are in certain ways administrative categories. Right? And I'm not going to deny that these are social categories as well. But my question there will be, what is the nature of ascriptive identity, the idea of social identity that you can place on the poor? Clearly not. And this is where I could also think about the poor as non-identity. But here is where things happen. Right? It's not necessary that all poor socially are treated equally. Right? I mean, this is the thing. This is where the government can be socially blind. Right? They can have administrative categories, which are purely produced by, if you like, biomedical or other sorts of human species knowledge that we're talking about, hunger. Right? But there are other things which don't come into this administration. And this is where I'm saying governmentality plays a role. So if I'm going to tell you about India, for example, that what do we do with the Dalit population? Let's start with some dramatic statements. Not all Dalits are poor, right? But almost all Dalits will tell you about humiliation, right? So now where do we put in this particular idea of governmentality versus administration? What you have in administration is constantly asking the Dalits to remain as Dalits so as they can be given a government resource of, let's say, affirmative reservation, or what we call affirmative policies or reservation policies. Now, what is the philosophical content of reservation? You are a Dalit, you must always remain a Dalit. Only then you can claim this administrative category. I'm saying that make humiliation the category, just like you can make poverty the category. if humiliation, suffering, and these are the difficult things that governmentality cannot administer. You see what my point is? Now, when you get into Ashish Nandy or Partha Chatterjee, and don't take me as being arrogant, but there is a particular way in political science cannot capture the social in their way in which they unfold their arguments. It's not, that's a disciplinary thing. For them, most of the time, the social is something that is this vague category that comes inside the social contract. It's something which is there. It's the political. And therefore, you can artificially figure out what is the political. What I'm saying is that it's very difficult to understand the political because you have not understood the social yet. And the social can work both ways. It can work, as you're saying, ground up, and it can also work top down. The government is not only administration. The government is entirely social. You see, this is the point, and this is why there is a constant debate, for example, in between what is secular and what is not secular. It's a pointless argument beyond a point. You know what I'm saying? So this is the kind of thing, and I'm not also going to suggest that anything that I'm saying is going to be terribly popular, but it's something that I feel, especially after the pandemic, we're beginning to, at least we need to start thinking about what is biomedical, what is physiological, what is social, what is not, and what is going on in all of this. Most of us are at the mercy of governments and administrators. So how do we, I would have preferred to be at the mercy of some doctors, but that's not how it works.
Okay, thank you.
Here,
does that make any sense? Or say, I'm not sure I made any sense, but I tried.
No, you made a lot of sense. I have to process it.
Okay.
yeah, no, there's stuff to think about here. Like you might be getting emails in the next couple of weeks, like asking for clarifications.
I'll be most grateful because this is work in progress. And as I can imagine that it's all, in my head, it's all not so great at this point. I have to think through many things, but at least some parts I'm very convinced about, but not all. Anyway, sorry.
It's coming across really well. I think that's it. We're all like thinking here and processing. Let me read you the question from the chat as we keep on processing. Okay. This is Elif from Berlin, and I wanted to ask your opinion over how other naming policies, like calling refugees or terrorists, right? Naming refugees or terrorists, maybe even master and slave. How do these naming policies relate to the COVID case? Similarities and differences, and maybe there can be a general guideline to understand these methods of creating power. Thank you. That's an even more difficult question.
Yeah, I mean, look, it is naming is by itself is a fairly large proposition. I don't want to condense it into just the naming of categories of people. I mean, there is something going on there, which is whether linguistically, semantics, semiotics, it's all a very complicated story. But the point that I was probably trying to make in that other paper, which maybe I can draw some links out of that to this one as well, is that, again, naming, as we know, is very much about power. It's one of the points I've tried to make, is that how do you manage to call a category of people, give it a name, such that that name has some access to whatever you want at the other end, namely justice, namely resources, namely anything that we are talking about here, medical care, whichever way we want to go. For me, the question here that you're asking is something more. It is about, and this is something I think is very important, and it's kind of almost interesting that you're bringing in the master-slave idea here, or refugees or terrorists. See, this is the important thing about naming that I'm trying to put. It's not the name itself, the noun itself that I'm concerned with so much. I'm concerned with the relationship that is created between two names. right? I mean, this is an essential Foucauldian sense of power. It is not about the categories. It doesn't matter, whether I call myself, a terrorist or a refugee. What it means is, what is the relationship between me and whatever that I'm dealing with at the other end? And that is the production of power. You see, by calling something a terrorist, did you see how in a second multiplicities of power relations are manufactured? So, for example, if you're talking about terrorists, the minute, right, when we started, let's say even post 9/11 in New York, once you have the idea of terrorists, look at the power relationships that are multiplying across the world. Take something banal from your airport, right? From the way you look, the way the name your passport carries, right? Every little relationship that you are experiencing becomes and can become a relationship of power. Right? So, similarly, as you can see now, if you want to pull that into a pandemic situation, this has been going on forever now, right? I mean, it almost seems like 2 years has been forever in our lives. Now it's about what is the relationship that you're now talking about, right? Go back again to a similar thing like terrorism and think about the COVID virus. Your experience of it is a relationship with your man at the airport. Are you going to be let out or not? Right? And these are constantly changing, right? So it's like today, America has some sort of regulations. Tomorrow it has some other Britain, the whole British government comes up with new regulations. So, it's that Norway forgets about COVID entirely. So, so it's really a strange way in which your everyday relationships, right up to very powerful situations of who can or who cannot move, right, becomes a very important question in this. So therefore, coming back to the naming question, I think naming, and this is not something I'm saying, it has been said a number of times, the question is not the name itself, it's the relationship that matters. And for me, what relationship a name brings into the political, right? And that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about in terms of power. I hope that works as an answer.
Fantastic answer. Very inspiring. It's true, right? It's not in the name. It's about the alterity. It's about the boundaries. It's about everything else that gets produced.
That's right.
So should we?
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
Yes, approaching our final minutes. So thank you so much. Thank you very much again, Yasmeen Arif. This was really, really inspiring. And I'm looking very much forward to following also the continuation of this essay. It's really fantastic and really very innovative. And this is already, I guess, our lecture number 8, and brought really a lot of new perspectives and insights into the discussion on Corona. Thank you so much. Yeah.
No, thank you
very much.
Thank all of you, because I think, as I said, this is fairly new work, and you've given me a safe space to talk and discuss. So that's really very nice. And I'm happy to also continue this conversation. Thank you so much, really, for giving me this opportunity. And thanks to all those